Donc, bonjour à tous et à toutes. Aujourd'hui, on ouvre la troisième et dernière journée du congrès du CRIHN avec l'intervenant Eric Gidal. Eric Gidal is professor of English at the University of Iowa and editor of Philological Quarter. His scholarship and teaching are grounded in the 18th and 19th centuries and explore the intersections of literature, environment, and media. He is the author, most recently, of Oceanic Unconformities, Bardic Poetry in the Industrial Age, in 2015, which studied the reception of Jane McPherson's poems of Ocean in relation to the environmental history of Scottish industrialization, a project he describes as an experiment in eco-critical book studies. More recently, he has been working collaboratively with Michael Gavin at the University of South Carolina to extend the concerns of his book into the areas of computational semantics and historical GIS. A report on these efforts appeared last November in Cultural Analytics as Scotland Poetics of Space, an experiment in geospatial semantics. His talk today will report on the most recent experiments in what may provisionally be called infrastructural semantics. So, Eric, please.
Thank you. It's nice to actually be in the room, and thank you all for showing up. I wanted to start by thanking Michael very much for inviting me here. I've been enjoying myself in Montreal very, very much. And again, thanks to all of you, not only for your patience, but for showing up on a Saturday morning to hear what I'm going to talk about. I want to start with some preliminary remarks before I get into the weeds. First of all, to note that the work I'm going to be presenting you today, for the most part, is very much the product of a collaboration with Michael Gavin at the University of South Carolina, who works in computational linguistics and considers himself a computational humanist, and has a deep interest in recent publications in vector semantics, and my own interest then in environmental history and literary studies. I want to speak, return to that lovely introduction really briefly, and just tell you a little bit about the work I've been doing the last few years, because it'll make much more sense before we get into the kind of weeds of the smaller project that I'm going to talk to you about. This book that I wrote a few years ago, Oceanic Unconformities, Bardic Poetry in the Industrial Age, I characterized as an experiment in eco-critical book studies. And the aim of that study was to think about book studies and book history as a kind of descriptive record of environmental history. And then the work that Michael and I have most recently published in Cultural Analytics last year, Scotland's Poetics of Space, we described as an experiment in geospatial semantics. So you can see that I like the term experiment. And what I'm going to present to you today is also an experiment. And all I really want out of that term is just to note that in some respects, what I'm going to be offering you is a very, very close reading of a very small selection of materials, but it has larger ambitions. And so I want to speak just a little bit about those larger ambitions, even though the disconnect between the kind of size of the ambitions I'm going to talk to you about and the small details, it can be a little wide. So a lot of my interest in environmental literary studies is a kind of reaction against a lot of trends in eco-criticism, articulated here by Timothy Clark in his book, Eco-Criticism on the Edge, which aims to try to find different ways of thinking about environment and literature besides questions of what we might think of as environmental ethics or cultural imagination. So Timothy Clark thinks and criticizes the notion that it's no longer really plausible to describe the environmental problem itself as Lawrence Buell and others do, as a crisis of the imagination. And that rather what we need to think about is different ways of describing the historical record that has led us to our current moment. And here, and this is just another quote from another scholar who I take a lot of inspiration from, Jeremy Davies, in his book of 2016, I believe, The Birth of the Anthropocene. And he says this is a book about how to take the measure of a crisis. And so a lot of what interests me about the potential, both for kind of fine-grained book studies and for large-scale computational humanities, is a kind of descriptive ambition to try to think about, again, the historical record in relationship to our environmental crisis, less in terms of forms of imagination and less in terms of searching for a kind of environmental ethics, important as those tasks may be, and more to try to think about a kind of thick description of the historical record. And so what I'm going to talk to you about today is what Michael and I have been working on most recently, and trying to think about historical connections between language, environment, and infrastructure. Our recent work in the past, we've been primarily interested in the first two, language and environment. And by environment, less thinking again about kind of absorptive or inhabiting forms of the environment, and more a kind of form of historical geography and economic geography. And increasingly, for reasons I'm going to explain, infrastructure has become increasingly important in the ways we think about a kind of interface between human activities and the natural world. So conceptually, what I'm going to be talking about is these historical connections. Methodologically, what I'm going to talk about is the ways in which we've been combining corpus linguistics, GIS, and network analysis. And so I'm going to be kind of moving back and forth really between these kind of methodological ambitions and these larger conceptual ambitions. And again, even though the experiment that I'm going to share with you today is rather narrow in its focus, I want to frame it by these larger considerations. So a little bit about historical GIS and corpus linguistics and how the two have been brought together. A lot of work has been done recently on thinking about the intersection between these two, and historical GIS and corpus linguistics is a field that aims to reveal the underlying spatial patterns or latent geographies that are often contained in textual data. The notion is that any corpus, any kind of given archive of textual material, be it oral, manuscript, or print, that has some kind of spatial component can be transferred into the realm of GIS and understood as interoperable with other ways of thinking about historical geography. And trying to ask how particular places acquire meaning over time, how particular meanings develop spatial associations over time, and how particular bodies of oral traditions, written archives, and/or printed media may be correlated with historical geography. Knowing the audience here today, I'm sure a lot of you can come up with many, many examples of similar projects. I just want to share a couple with you. And again, this comes out of my interests as well in Scottish literature and the kind of Northern English industrial history. So there's this project of Literary Edinburgh that Miranda Anderson and James Loxley have used, in which basically what they're doing is trying to map the ways in which various literary works and non-literary works can be mapped over the course of historical Edinburgh, how different routes described in these works can be understood, and how different kinds of correlations and connections can be developed. A second, which is actually methodologically a little closer to what Michael and I have been doing, is this project, which Ian Gregory and Christopher Donaldson have been working on, mapping the Lake District. And what they're interested in is not only literature, but travel accounts and any other kind of printed material description of the English Lake District from the 18th and 19th and even into the early 20th century, how different features in the landscape were described. So they're less interested then in particular narratives or particular points of view, and really how a kind of semantic field gets mapped across a territory over time, and what kinds of insights can be developed from that. This is similar to what Ian Gregory and Andrew Hardy have referred to as visual gisting, which is in some sense an odd pun, but what they're after is attempts to use corpus methods to bridge the gap between the textual content of a corpus and georeference database at the heart of a GIS. So those are a couple of examples, again, of this connection between GIS and corpus linguistics. At the same time, in the less digital or less computational humanities, there's been quite a focus recently on infrastructure. And I just want to highlight three studies that have been particularly inspiring or interesting to me. This first is from Shannon Matter in her wonderful book, Code and Clay, Data and Dirt, connects kind of very material archaeological records of cities over the last 5,000 years with different understandings of media. And her attempt is to think about what she calls the deep time of the media infrastructure, and to define media as embodied on a macro scale, as a force whose modes and ideologies and aesthetics of operation can be spatialized and materialized in the landscape. A second example of this kind of infrastructural studies that particularly connects here with questions of environment comes from John Durham Peters in his book, The Marvelous Clouds, which is a wide-ranging book over what he calls elemental media, fire, air, water, etc. But he promotes very early on and throughout the book a kind of infrastructuralism that shares, in Peter's words, a classic concern of media theory, the call to make environments visible. And then a third example that I'm going to spend just a little bit more time with comes from Nicole Starosielski's book, The Undersea Network, as well as a digital project I'll share in a minute, and her pursuit of network archaeology. She's very interested and has done extensive research on the undersea cables that connect most of the digital world that we're inhabiting. And her ambition of network archaeology is to historicize the movements and connections enabled by distribution systems and to reveal the environments that shape contemporary media circulation. And this comes out in her book. It also comes out in a just wonderful digital project that she's worked on. And I just want to make sure I get the correct names, with Eric Lawyer and Shane Brennan, this piece, Surfacing, which traces the routes of fiber optic cables as a critical infrastructure of our global network society. Providing close focused accounts of different sites, such as Kitibaraki's Japan, a center of coal mining in the 19th century, connected to Tokyo, which was 100 miles away by rail, again in the 19th century, but more recently the site of a major cable center, which was temporarily severed from the US and Asian networks in a 2011 earthquake that devastated the city. And one aim of this project is to understand these routes then in relation to turbulent ecologies, those are her terms, rather than friction-free and stable landscapes. As well as charting the cable network, its central gateways, its constricted route lines, and its coastal landing points. So here is one example of the intersection of media studies, environmental studies, and infrastructure studies. And it's one far more accomplished than anything I'm about to share with you today, which is an odd rhetorical strategy of mine. But again, I want you to see at least what the ambitions are, or at least the inspirations of what we're doing when we look at something like this. This is a map of the circulation of letters in Scotland. It was produced as part of the Postal Reform Act of 1839, and its aim is to think about the routes by which letters were circulated in Scotland and to standardize postal rates in reference to Euclidean distance, excuse me. The map combines at least three means of defining any particular place: physical location, distance from the metropole, in this case Edinburgh, and connection to a postal network. And it raises questions about how the language of any relevant corpus dealing with these places might register these factors. Beyond affirming the centrality of Edinburgh, and to a lesser extent Glasgow, each of which has provided an inset detailing the local penny post, the map visualizes functional affinities between an arc of major nodes, such as Inverness, Aberdeen, and Carlisle, and more regional nodes, such as Elgin and Banff in the north, Stirling and Perth in the central region, and Dumfries and Berwick in the south. Despite its focus on distance from Edinburgh as the most relevant standard, the map demonstrates how the geographical relation between any two places may be described not only through reference to physical environment, but also in relation to routes, technologies, and relative frequencies of communication and commerce. So in order to explore these intersections in greater detail, what Michael and I have done is built a network model from the collection of postal directories published online by the National Library of Scotland. And we've combined it with the parish reports collected into the Old and New Statistical Accounts of Scotland in the 1790s and 1830s and 40s, respectively. So the postal directories provide mail coach routes and times, postal delivery dates, carrier schedules, canal and rail departures, and shipping calendars. The statistical accounts provide regional representations of national transport and communication, alongside records of population growth and agricultural development, ecclesiastical history and local antiquities, manufacturing, resource extraction, and energy consumption. And we've derived three different kinds of data from these sources. The first is relational data in the postal directories, showing which locations were connected to which in travel, shipping, and communication routes. Semantic data in the statistical accounts, showing which words were used to describe which places, and geocoordinates providing the latitude and longitude of each location. When combined, these data sets allow us to compare changing patterns in the semantics of geographic description with transformations in the infrastructural networks that supported Scotland's industrial development. So, a little bit more about the sources. Statistical accounts of Scotland are just absolutely fascinating. They're these chorographic encyclopedias that were produced, as I said, both in the 1790s and then in the 1830s and 40s. And the old, or simply the original statistical account, was compiled by Sir John Sinclair, who's an agricultural improver and member of Parliament from Caithness in the north. It was dedicated to the collection of localized descriptions in the interest of guiding national policy. And in his quest to describe what he called the natural history and political state of Scotland, Sinclair distributed questionnaires of 160 items to every parish minister in Scotland and published their responses in 21 volumes over the course of the decade. The reports vary widely in their adherence to Sinclair's prescriptions and are as interesting for their range of rhetorical styles and local agendas as for any quantitative information they provide. But still, Sinclair aimed, in his words, and again, this is a quote from Sinclair, to ascertain the internal structure of society, the various classes into which a society containing about 1,550,000 souls is divided, the modes by which they respectively obtain their subsistence, and the means by which their condition may be improved. And much of his efforts after the publication lay in finding all sorts of different kind of computational and quantitative relations between the many figures that the parish ministers provided. The new statistical account was begun by the Society for the Benefit of the Sons and Daughters of the Clergy in the 1830s, and it was republished as a 15-volume set in 1845. And as with the old account, the new account was arranged parish by parish, though it accepted reports from a wider range of individuals. So side by side, these accounts offer parallel descriptions of Scottish physical and human geography, separated by a half-century of rapid economic growth and industrialization. And the advertisement to the first issue of the new statistical account suggests as much. It observes, and this is the quote that I'm giving you here, Scotland in the interval, again between the 1790s and the 1830s, has assumed another aspect in its agriculture, its commerce and manufactures, in all its institutions, and even in the character of its populations. Changes and the spirit that begets them have extended to the most secluded of the parishes. The Society do not hesitate to announce that they now present not merely a new statistical account, but in great measure, the statistical account of a new country. So, working with a team of staff and undergraduate research assistants at the University of Iowa, we gathered our semantic data from the text of the OSA and the NSA, the new old account and the new account. We began by dividing the full text of the accounts into separate entries, marking them up with very simple XML structure, and assigning identifiers for each. Latitude and longitude information were taken from Wikidata, which, unlike government-issued spatial data sets, includes many historical parishes, even those that are no longer official administrative entities in the United Kingdom. And we move from that kind of semantic or descriptive account of Scotland to a network model that we constructed from the tables of departures and destinations listed in the Scottish postal directories. And these directories were first published in Dundee, Edinburgh, and Glasgow at the end of the 18th century, and they became increasingly common and regularized over the 19th. And much like phone books of the 20th century, postal directories list the names and addresses of local people and businesses. However, they also include appendices with various additional information, such as the rates of local porters and omnibus services, new municipal regulations, or anything else the publishers thought might be of interest to their readers. Almost always, these appendices include information about stagecoaches and carriers, providing the names of managers, routes, and the days and times of departure and arrival. Directories usually included detailed schedules of the postal service itself, listing where letters and parcels could be sent at what times, and the routes of expanding penny posts whereby letters could be circulated within an urban area, increasingly across a region, for a single fee. More than mere lists of names and addresses, then, these directories record a number of overlapping and competing networks of transport and communication, only some of which were part of the official Scottish Post. Each directory therefore captures a snapshot of Scotland's modernizing infrastructure. Taken together, the directories enable us to reconstruct in fine detail Scotland's networks of travel, transport, and communication. So we transcribed travel, shipping, and postal routes from 12 directories, selected over 3 periods, the 1790s, the 1820s, and the 1840s, which represent significant stages in the expansion and consolidation of Scotland's transportation and communication systems. For each coach or carrier route, we recorded several pieces of information: the transportation type, the starting point, the destination, the location of any stops along the way, the travel frequencies, and the carrier's name and street locations if available. Our data set includes Edinburgh, Glasgow, Greenock, Aberdeen, Dundee, Renfrewshire, Ayr, and Paisley. Across the 12 directories, we identified a network of 1,061 nodes that share 6,036 edges. This was all handled by manual transcription, a very fun way to spend one spring break, recording all relevant data into a sequence of tables by which we could then construct and assess both attributional and relational data in the network. We were thus able to measure changes across the network, both in the aggregate and in particular to different modes of connection, charting rises in the number of locations and routes, distances and frequencies, carrying capacities and centralizations. Not only were more cities connected to the network as the half-century progressed, but the shape of the network changed as well. The paucity of cross-posts, or postal relays between secondary and tertiary areas, created and reinforced the central place system connecting cities, towns, and villages, and gave regional hubs an increasing role in the distribution of mails, goods, and people. Not only did the geographic reach of the network expand, it became denser. Rather than measure any particular node in the network simply by its distance from a central metropole, by the 1840s, it makes as much, if not more sense, to measure its degree of connectivity. When we look at the network as a whole, we can see that while its degree distribution increases significantly during the half century, so that many nodes besides Edinburgh and Glasgow have significant degrees of connectivity, it nonetheless retains differentiations between nodes, so that we can attend to different categories of hubs as sharing certain characteristics, not by geographical location, but by virtue of their position within the network. So really briefly to talk about this table, the first column here offers the central nodes with the highest degree of connectivity. Defined here as the number of links in or out connecting a node to its neighbors. To nobody's surprise, Edinburgh and Glasgow are at the top of the list, followed by most of the major cities of Scotland. Change over time is captured in the second column, which captures rising nodes. These are towns that have significant connections by the 1840s, but have no more than a single link in the 1790s. They cover a range of geographical regions, from Ayton in Berwickshire on the eastern coast to Loch Gilfeed in Argyll and Bute in the west, and from Castle Douglas in Galloway in the south to Banff in Aberdeenshire in the north. None of these are major hubs by the standards of overall network traffic, but each demonstrates significant changes in regional connectivity over the half century. Finally, bridge nodes are towns that are neither the largest central cities nor the newly well-connected hubs, but rather are important small points of contact in peripheral locations. They are identified by dividing each node's betweenness by its degree, where betweenness is the number of paths crossing through a node, and degree is the number of links touching it. Places that score highly on this metric are mostly coastal towns, mostly along the North Sea and throughout the Highlands. So these three categories are defined again, not by physical location, but by their changing position within an evolving network. So again, I told you that what I'm going to present to you here is much less well accomplished than Starosielski's beautiful surfacing, but this is my attempt working with the Scottish Postal Directories and the map of the circulation letters to give you another sense of how these nodes work. So the city of Perth is a ready example of a central node. Already a significant manufacturing town in the Scottish linen trade, as well as a transport and communication hub in the 1790s, Perth's robust production of linen, cottons, leather, paper, and linseed oil is well recorded in the old statistical account, as are its salmon fisheries and flour mills. But it is only in the new account that Perth's function as a post town is recorded in any detail, and this is from the new account. The roads diverge from the city as a center, one to Edinburgh on the south, two to Glasgow on the west, one to Dunkeld, Inverness, etc. on the north, one to Aberdeen on the northeast. They are not now, as they were formerly, ill-made and ill-kept. They are made and kept in repair entirely upon Mr. McAdam's judicious system, to the incalculable benefit and comfort of the traveler. On all these roads, 4 host coaches run daily. Indeed, by the 1840s, Perth enjoyed stagecoach connections to Glasgow 5 times a day, as well as daily or near daily coaches to Edinburgh, Kinross, Auchtermuchty, Crieff, and Forfar. It enjoyed penny post services to Bankfoot, Bridge of Erne, Aberdeen, Kinross, Methven, Moffat, Scone, and Linwilk, as well as regular postal services to Edinburgh and Glasgow. Naturally, Perth is not anywhere as central a hub as Edinburgh or Glasgow, but despite the absence of nearby canals or rail lines and the dependence of the steamboats to Dundee on the tidal cycles, Perth is a critical hub and plays an increasingly central role as a node in the network. Airdrie to the south and west offers a strong example of a rising node. Despite its relative proximity, it had only thrice weekly connections to Glasgow in the 1790s, but is increasingly integrated into the network over the coming decades. By the 1840s, it is well connected to Glasgow by rail, coach, and carrier, and to Edinburgh daily by 2 coach lines. Its situation is well recorded by the Reverend James Begg in his new account report for the parish of New Monkland, which notes the turnpike roads from Edinburgh to Glasgow and from Carlisle to Stirling, and coal transport along the railroads and canals to Edinburgh, Greenock, and on to Ireland. Comparably, Montrose, though situated over 100 miles away along the eastern coast between Dundee and Aberdeen, has a similar profile as a rising node, The Reverend Alexander Mollison's old statistical account report notes the public construction of a bridge over the North Esk River in 1775, a great advantage to the neighboring country, as passage along the post road to Aberdeen had frequently proved fatal to travelers, and also notes plans for a second bridge along the South Esk. Quote, "It will doubtless contribute much to the advantage of Montrose and will add to the value of lands in that neighborhood. And if the roads are once put in proper order, will be an additional inducement to bring the mail coaches along this coast to the north of Scotland, the benefit of which will be very great." By the time of the new statistical account, the parish has 3 toll roads along with the northern post road, and the town of Montrose boasts its own post office with an annual gross revenue of £2,000. The Reverends Robert Smith and Joseph Patterson report a daily coach to Edinburgh and a second that runs between Perth and Aberdeen, and regular stops by the steamboats from Aberdeen 6 or 7 months of the year. So while Airdrie and Montrose are geographically quite distinct, it makes sense to speak of them as occupying analogous positions within the emergent urban network. Broadford on Skye offers a good example of a bridge node, our third category, with mails passing through 3 times a week by the 1840s. Within the incumbent's recollection, reports the Reverend John McKinnon, letters from London took 10 days in reaching Broadford, but now they arrive in 3. But Broadford's significance is not simply its increase in capacity of traffic to London, but its role as a regional hub. Again, quote, "From Broadford, the mails are carried across Killiecran Ferry by a runner to Loch Carron, whence they are conveyed to Dingwall by a gig, having accommodation for the conveyance of passengers. About 30 miles of Parliamentary Road and 10 of statute labor pass in different directions through the parish. During the summer and harvest months, we have a regular weekly communication with Glasgow by steamboats, but in winter they ply only once a fortnight. Not many years ago, the voyage from Skye to Clyde generally occupied from 10 to 15 days, while now it is usually performed in about 36 hours. So, both the post office directories and the statistical accounts of Scotland record a burgeoning urban network. Transformations in the range and frequency of this network are recorded quantitatively in the directories and descriptively in the accounts, and allow us to perceive important connections and similarities between otherwise far-flung regions and towns. The interdependence of regional identification and national interconnection that Lynn Holland Lees has identified as a principle of urban networks in Great Britain during this period is borne out by comparing the directories and accounts of the 1790s with those of the 1840s. As the network becomes more densely concentrated, towns and burghs that don't even appear in the old statistical account register as significant nodes within an increasingly integrated structure of commerce, transportation, and communication. But it is also possible to examine the language of the statistical accounts as a register of this expanding network and to trace significant changes in geosemantic patterns across space and time. So the semantic data we took from the statistical accounts is represented in 2 matrices, 5,203 by 738, the number of words that we considered significant by the number of parishes represented in both accounts. Where each word W is represented as a vector of length 738, showing its frequency in each parish description, and where each parish P is represented as a vector of length 5,203, showing the word frequency for each description. Obviously, what I'm showing you here is a highly simplified and abridged version of this. It would be very difficult to move through the entire matrices. But because the connection between language and place is a foundational structural element of the statistical accounts, measures of semantic distribution within the corpus are always also measures of geographical distribution. This connection between language and place allows us to describe semantic distributions across the spatialized languages of the parish reports. Which words are overrepresented in descriptions of which parishes and towns, and how are particular words distributed across parish descriptions? Which parishes are most similar or different in their semantic profiles, and which words are most similar or different in their geographical distributions? How do these measurements change over the half century that separates the old and new accounts? So using pretty basic tools of vector semantics, which I just quickly review here, we are able to describe the semantic profile of a place as the vector of words contained in its description, just as we are able to describe the semantic footprint of a word as the vector of places that word is used to describe. We can thus measure the cosine between any 2 vectors to ask how similar is the language used to describe any 2 places. How similar are the places described by any 2 words? And there are a number of ways of visualizing the results. One is mapping semantic footprints. Any word or collection of words can be mapped across a geographical region, so that just as we might map weather patterns or outbreaks of disease, we can map the concentration of terms in the statistical accounts. The simple distribution of words is often a clear index of changes in economic activity and commercial infrastructure. Consider, for example, terms related to the fishing industry. In the old account, the words fishery, fisheries, herring, and cod appeared 4 times or more in 52 parishes, mostly located along the coasts. As the fishing industry expanded, so too did uses of the words in parish descriptions. In the new account, the term appears at least 5 times in almost 100 parishes, filling in the coastlines and representing in aggregate a 30% increase in relative term frequency across the board. The centroid and reach of this term group remained stable, however. Changes in the fishing industry represented an evenly distributed thickening of already existing activities, the basic shape of which was well established by the end of the 18th century. By contrast, descriptions of the textile industry sharply contracted. The frequency ratio of the terms linen, yarn, cotton, flax, spinning, spindles, loom, and looms is just 0.518, meaning that references to textile production decreased almost by half. The decrease corresponds also to a shift in location, as the geographical centroid moved south by about 30 kilometers, and its radius contracted slightly. This contraction does not signal a decrease in actual production, just the opposite. It responds instead to the drift of textile manufacturing from the north, where during the 18th century, many women spun thread working hand-operated looms in their homes, to the south and west, where steam-powered factories in the central belt, and especially around Glasgow, began to dominate the industry. We can mark analogous changes from the old account to the new account in terms related to communication and transport: mail, post, coach, coaches, carriers. References to these terms were widely and evenly distributed throughout Scotland, as the centroid of the span of the term group remains quite stable and centrally located. However, whereas in the old account references to communication and transport were sparsely scattered across the parish descriptions, in the new account they are almost ubiquitous. The frequency ratio for this term group is 2.66, meaning an almost 3-fold increase in word use overall, and an almost 5-fold increase in the number of parishes where these terms are overrepresented. The concentration of production of textiles corresponds closely with the expansion of an infrastructural network that connected producers in the cities to customers elsewhere. So in each of these examples, we are mapping groups of words with high degrees of geosemantic correlation. But these correlations themselves are worth considering, both in their continuities across the two accounts and in their changes. To indicate that 2 or more words correlate geosemantically is to note that they appear in a statistically significant measure in an analogous array of parish reports, and are thus associated with an analogous range of places. Changes and continuities in these patterns between the 2 statistical accounts, how particular words are distributed, how patterns of distribution correlate between words, and the semantic profiles of particular parishes are measures of wider changes and continuities in Scottish culture and economy that have strong spatial components. For example, over both the old account and the new account, the OSA and the NSA, the word kiln shows high geosemantic correlation with the word lime. Places where kilns are described overlap significantly with places where lime is described. For another example, morality shows a high geosemantic similarity with religion. Places where morality is discussed overlap significantly with places where religion is mentioned. Neither of these results is at all surprising. Nor are we surprised across both accounts that dock shows high geosemantic correlations with ship, harbor, and tonnage, or that Bleachfield persistently correlates with mill, linen, machinery, and manufacturing, or that mine persistently correlates with coal and ore, or that pit persistently correlates with colliers and engine. These patterns demonstrate the efficacy of the statistical accounts as semantic registers of geospatial phenomena. Practices, be they material, social, or cultural, that had strong spatial correlations during this half-century, that is to say that were locatable in particular cities, parishes, or regions, will register as geosemantic patterns across the textual field of these 2 data sets. Because of the half-century that divides the old and the new accounts, we can also measure significant changes in geosemantic correlations as indexes of historical change. For example, names of common trees, ash, spruce, pine, elm, oak, beech, birch, alder, have similar, though not identical, geosemantic distributions in both accounts. But only in the new account does the word planted emerge with significantly similar patterns of distribution. Analogously, timber has a generally similar profile across both accounts, but is correlated in the new account with words such as plantation, foreign, and improved, a measure of the increasingly managed and commercialized systems of forestry in mid-19th century Scotland. Lime and kiln, as already mentioned, are persistently correlated geosemantically across both accounts, but both lime and limestone are more highly correlated with soil and various crops in the old account, whereas they're more highly correlated with coal and kiln in the new. In the old account, we find weaver in places similar to those for other terms of rural economy, tailors, smiths, veal, eggs, oats, whereas in the new account, it is more associated with industrial production, loom, goods, linen, cotton. Analogously, spinning correlates across both accounts with textile production, yarn, flax, but in the 1790s, these terms correlate with domestic production, women, lint, linen, servant, labor, or fuel, whereas in the 1840s, they correlate with factory production, spindles, mills, machinery, employment, loom, hours. Loom, likewise, moves from localized associations, provincial, market, voice, burg, to factors of national scale, manufacturing, Glasgow, yarn, cotton, power. Cotton, it should be noted, is already associated firmly with Glasgow machinery and Clyde manufacturers in the 1790s, whereas yarn only becomes highly correlated with mills and machinery in the new account. Textile production, in other words, occupies similar spaces over the first half of the 19th century, but those spaces are increasingly occupied by factors of industrial rather than rural economy. Some of the key terms of communicative infrastructure with which we are concerned also display interesting changes in geosemantic correlation across the two accounts. Carriage, associated with the movements of raw materials, coals, crops, flax in the old account, is more associated with system-wide connections, post-communication in the new. Vessel, understandably, is associated with words like sea, boat, fish, cod, and herring across both accounts. But whereas in the old account, it shares a geosemantic profile with words like wind and weather, in the new account, we can perceive the advent of new engines of mobility in words such as steam and navigation. Canal comes to share a strong geosemantic profile with railway and steam only in the new account, a clear semantic marker of the acceleration in carbon-fueled transport during the first half of the 19th century. More broadly, improvement, that topical marker of economic development across 18th and 19th century British history, assumes very different associations between the two accounts, aligning with the geosemantic profiles of agriculture, country, farmers, farms, crops, soil, and oats in the old account, but widening out its perspective to align with education, roads, draining, and economy in the new account. And this is where our categorization of nodes in the network model become interesting. For it is possible to compare the geographic distribution of these nodes with the geographic distribution of certain terms in the statistical accounts. The distribution of the central nodes, for example, corresponds with the distribution of terms associated with civic life: city, citizens, council, magistrates; commerce, corporation, managers, companies, company; education, students, faculty, university; medicine, patients, medicine, hospital; and culture, printing, museum. Rising nodes display a mostly rural set of terms in the old account: country, stone, village, parish, and an increasingly civic vocabulary in the new account: public, societies, teachers, fairs, funds, subscription, bank, independent. And bridge nodes, owing to their prevalence along coastal regions, display a more maritime vocabulary: vessels, tonnage, haddock, ships, mouth, fish, herrings. None of these vocabularies is purely represented in these locations, nor do these nodal categories display a consistently uniform semantic profile. But these categories are useful guides to shared attributes across an otherwise heterogeneous range of parishes within the statistical account, and they indicate how villages and burghs, both peripheral and central, came to assume certain features by virtue of their position within a networked infrastructure of communication and transport. And so just again to visualize, and again, this isn't anything like what Nicole Starosielski has done, but here in yellow, if you can make out the dots, I'm not sure how Clearly, you see the language of the central nodes, this kind of civic language distributed, again, not in terms of what I was showing you before, those kind of semantic footprints, but in terms of their position along different central nodes in the network. Comparably, the rising nodes marked in green display this change from a kind of more rural to a more civic vocabulary. And again, they're distributed widely geographically, but there is a kind of logic to the distribution of these terms when we look at the geography of the network. And then finally, the language of maritime vocabulary, fishing, primarily the fishing industry, is located along the coast. Again, not a profound revelation, except that when we notice the way in which that the network, the postal network, allows us to articulate and identify the places where this language is distributed across the terrain. So, in conclusion, this is an early experiment. It's using a discrete selection of directories and relatively uniform language of statistical description. But it already allows us to offer broad descriptions of the onset of infrastructural modernity in a crucial hub of global industrial development, and to demonstrate how evolving and residual paths of communication and transport may be perceived in the language by which places are described. Both the network structures described in the postal directories and the semantic distributions found in the statistical accounts are spatially locatable at the intersections of print circulation, physical environment, and economic change. The combination of network analysis and computational semantics we have demonstrated has allowed us to measure how a language of place emerges within spatial networks materially enabled through expanding infrastructures of communication and transport. Whereas most work in GIS and CL has viewed place as a socially produced sequence of values, ideas, and emotions that may be aligned with spatial coordinates, we are attempting to consider how semantic patterns in a geospatially rich corpus index changes in interconnections over historical time. Both discursive descriptions of particular places and semantic patterns across a geographical corpus register the expansion and decentralization of urban networks that forms a central part of Scotland's economic, political, cultural, and environmental history. Merci.
So now we have like 15 minutes for questions. Do you have some questions? Yes, Cecily?
Yeah, hi, thank you so much, Eric, for your time. I wanted to know, I mean, given your background, where the literary fits in all this. Given also, I'm sure how much you've also read from this time frame, are you seeing things that kind of reinforce what you already know about Scottish literature in that particular moment in history? Or are there surprises to you? What's the eventual goal in terms of bringing literature into this and cultural production?
Yeah, no, thank you for that question, right? Because, I mean, this focus on semantics seems a long way from kind of literary aesthetics and questions of style, form, genre, cultural communications in different ways. It seems there are two questions you're asking me. One, first is the relationship between those, and then what are we finding that's surprising? The relation between those I view as a kind of micro and macro description. Again, my opening remarks were meant to suggest that I'm more and more dissatisfied or find insufficient aesthetic, ethical, even cultural descriptions of literature in relationship to environmental history. And I'm more and more interested in how literature offers an index or a register or even a signature of environmental changes over time. To that end, what I have been doing outside of this kind of computational work is a kind of close, finely grained kind of book history and book studies, and thinking very much about poetics and cultural material. What this allows me to do in collaboration with Mike is to think about similar kind of infrastructure, as it were, of print distribution of language, of the distribution of language, and its relationship to economic and industrial development. And so I view them as kind of two differently scaled descriptions of a very similar phenomenon. But the questions you need to ask when you're looking at a kind of fine-grained work of literature, or thinking about stylistics, or thinking about material aspects of individual books and book production, are, of course, different kinds of questions and different kinds of tools that you use on this analysis. But I view them as two aspects of the same. The second part of your question is, what are we discovering? Because a lot of what I showed you here is pretty much old news to any historical geographer of Scottish industrial development. In fact, it's the parameters of Scottish historical geography that have allowed us to make sense of sometimes inchoate patterns of semantic distribution and say, well, what's going on here in different ways. I would say, though, that we have found certain things of interest. I didn't really focus at all about literature here. In earlier iterations, we were thinking about antiquarian literature, and specifically the poems of Ossian, which is what I wrote my last book on. And a kind of antithesis that was often established in 18th and 19th century Scottish literature between heritage, as it were, and improvement. That is to say, I look to the past and I look to kind of grounded models of cultural descriptions and these kind of spatial and environmental changes. But when you actually look at some of the semantic patterns, you realize that the places and the patterns of semantic description of antiquarian and folkloric and literary and cultural heritage are not actually so spatially distinct from patterns of industrial development. And in fact, it allows you to describe, I think, again, in a more detailed form, the interdependence of those two phenomena. That is to say, the kind of cultural emergence of a kind of Scottish nationalist vision of heritage and the economic and industrial transformation of the landscape. And that kind of somewhat counterintuitive connection, at least from certain perspectives, has been something that has been borne out when we start looking at these wider range of semantic patterns.
Yeah, thank you very much for a fascinating presentation. I really enjoyed it. I just thought, while I was listening to you, I was thinking of people doing intelligence work, you know, by focusing on newspapers and whatever information they can lay their hands on and try to get an interpretation of something in any given society. And to go back to the question that was just raised of the role of literature, in your case, you're starting with a very specific corpus, the NSA, the OSA. They are very, very typified in some ways. They force you, in a sense, in a certain perspective that you're not going to be able to escape from very easily. But this raises a different kind of issue, which is if you started looking at various kinds of corpora that would allow you to do the same thing over the same territory, then you might be able to locate what literature or literary or any other kind of cultural event, for that matter, where it might fit in relationship with other events, in order to get a sort of naturalistic map of the culture of a region over a certain period of time. I mean, what you're opening up there is the possibility of a huge, magnificent research program to relocate the meaning of what is literature in a society at a given time, in a given territory.
Absolutely. I guess because of the video, I should stay here. My inclination is to start walking and talking about there. But absolutely, and you frame that very, very nicely. The appeal to us of the old statistical accounts and new statistical accounts, there were several appeals, but one of the appeals was how much the language of the question of geography and the question of language were already kind of built in. They were incredibly easy. The XML markup was very easy because there weren't a whole lot of variables. The language is clearly organized according to places. But absolutely, this is a language of governmental management, economic control, and improvement. And it is a very, very particular kind of language. Now, I do have to focus on the idea that these descriptions are all localized in the sense that these are all parish ministers in these places providing these reports. And particularly in the old account, there's a wide variety of rhetorical approaches and different kinds of agendas that gets a little more homogenized in the new account. But absolutely, the next step would be to think for other kind of geospatially rich corpora. We've been talking with someone thinking about working class poetry that was published in a lot of working class newspapers during the Industrial Revolution, very much tied to places because these were not so much nationally distributed works as much more local and regional. And that would be one area to go. Any corpus where you have a strong geospatial component. Now, as to say, you could say, yes, this language makes sense to talk about in terms of this place, could be added to this. And so this is just a kind of initial experiment. And certainly one of the impulses would be to get away from the language of statistical description and much more thinking about alternative cultural, class-based economic kind of concerns. The problem is, of course, has to do, I mean, the corpora are available. I mean, the 19th century is just rich in this material, but the ways in which you identify particular language with particular places becomes tricky. particularly because of the centralization of publication. So simply, thinking about how various novels that are being all produced in Edinburgh are describing places in the north or in the west becomes a little more tricky, I think, than what goes on here. But again, this corpora just suggested itself both for the ease by which we could think about language in relation to place. And also, I have to admit, a certain aesthetic and cultural fascination with the project. I mean, John Sinclair is just an absolutely fascinating figure, and there's the tenacity and obsession that was needed to compile this amazing database over the course of the 1790s is quite impressive. And I wouldn't characterize all of his ambitions as nefarious or terrible. He was very much trying to seek to give all of these local places a real voice and to try to think about how they could be conceptualized in relationship to each other. And that was that brief quote I gave you from Lynn Holland Leeds about regionalism and nationalism, that as these places become more interconnected, in some sense, the language of regional articulation becomes all the more prominent. But your point is very well taken, and particularly in connection with Cecily's earlier question. And yes, absolutely. What I'm trying to articulate here is a certain methodology that could well be expanded to a much richer range of language.
It was fascinating talk, Eric. Thank you very much for that. I was wondering whether you've probably played with the Republic of Letters website, the Stanford project.
Yeah.
Have you actually contemplated either partnering with other people who do that kind of UX environment? Because I was just, wondering, it would be just amazing to see that map. I mean, mates, between the growth of, not just the nodes in a kind of, DH oriented, but I'm more thinking about a wider audience, public interested in the topic, to follow that letter leaving Glasgow on the morning of,
That's right. Oh yeah, the potentials for kind of expanding on this, great. Have we thought about it? Sure. Late night over beers, it's a great idea. Got to get the money and the time to do that. Absolutely. But no, very much. I mean, and the stuff they're doing with mapping the Enlightenment at Stanford is very much, a kind of early inspiration for this, for thinking less about the kind of, or not, I shouldn't say less, thinking about the content of letters, but and I don't know if people know this project, but the idea is, the huge Republic of Letters in the 18th century, just mapping who corresponded with whom. So you can look at any key figure from the Enlightenment and kind of map out what their kind of networks of correspondence were. And then that in turn allows them to kind of go back into the actual letters and the thoughts and writings of the Enlightenment figures and think about them in a new way. Absolutely. And, given time and money and connections with other people, we'd love to do that. At this point, again, we're seeing this as a kind of sequence of early experiments, but the next step would be certainly to scale everything up and try for more. But I have to say, although it's a little awkward, and maybe if I can just get this map back. Well, anyway, I find that map endlessly fascinating. And again, it's another instance of this kind of early Victorian data visualization project that was purely done because they were trying to figure out how to set postal rates. And what they wound up doing was just expanding the penny post, where it didn't matter. Once you're in the network, you're in the network, and it's the same cost everywhere. This is this weird kind of transitional moment. But the Victorians were just lovely in terms of data curation and data visualization, and the chance to kind of engage in dialogue with them, engage in dialogue with people who produce this map, engage in dialogue with people like Sir John Sinclair or the Society for the Benefit of the Sons and Daughters of the Clergy. I think they were early DH pioneers, and it's nice to kind of bring the tools that we have into connection with them in order to allow some of the richness of the databases that they collected to come forward.
Still 5 more minutes? Somebody? No? So I take
Oh, we got one more.
I mean, just as a suggestion.
Yes.
During the period, particularly after 1800, in the period of the rapid rise of local societies in the UK and England and Scotland, that might be a way to establish a new corpus of correspondence and publications of the society, which should be both very localized in some ways, because they try to project the voice of a small community, and at the same time with attention towards being globalized, because they want to be heard by the rest of the world, particularly in Britain, but even beyond. So you'd have a very interesting relationship between the local and the global emerging through these particular kinds of materials.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion. And again, what would, on top of many other things, one thing that would be interesting was how they're already kind of structuring their language and their correspondence with both an eye towards the regional and an eye towards the global, essentially. And the kind of rhetorical analysis that one could play out is the kind of next step up from the kind of semantic distributions that we're talking about here. So yeah, the possibilities seem infinite.
No more questions? So let's thank Eric and have a break. And if you want to ask some more questions to Eric, with a coffee.
Yes, very good.